The small town of Riverbrook sat nestled between rolling hills, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business by sundown. At the heart of this tight-knit community stood the local hospital, and at the heart of that hospital was Dr. James Harrison. For 20 years, Dr. Harrison had been the town's most trusted surgeon. His steady hands had stitched up farming accidents, delivered countless babies, and removed more appendixes than he cared to count. At 45, his life followed a comfortable pattern: early mornings at the hospital, late evenings catching up on medical journals, and weekends tending to his vegetable garden or volunteering at the free clinic he'd helped establish years ago. "James, you need more than just work in your life," his nurse and longtime friend Patricia would tell him, but Dr. Harrison would just smile and say his patients were family enough. The truth was, after his marriage ended 10 years earlier, he'd found peace in his solitary life. He wasn't lonely, he was focused. That all changed on a rainy Tuesday in April when ambulance sirens cut through the usual quiet of Riverbrook. A terrible car accident on the highway had claimed 2 lives and left their 12-year-old son fighting for his own. The boy arrived covered in blood, unconscious but still breathing. Dr. Harrison worked through the night, refusing to leave the operating room until he was certain the child would survive. When those small eyes finally opened 3 days later, something shifted in the doctor's heart. "Where are my mom and dad?" the boy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Harrison had delivered bad news countless times in his career, but nothing had prepared him for the look in those eyes when he explained what had happened. The boy, his name was Andra, had no family to speak of. No grandparents, no aunts or uncles who could take him in. "What's going to happen to me now?" Andra asked, tears streaming down his face. That question haunted Dr. Harrison for days. He found himself checking on Andra more often than his other patients, bringing him books and sitting with him during lunch breaks. They talked about science, about the stars, about Andra's dream of becoming a doctor himself someday. "You remind me of myself at your age," Dr. Harrison told him one afternoon. "Always asking questions, always wanting to know how things work." As the days passed and Andra grew stronger, social services began making arrangements for foster care. The thought of this bright, curious boy being shuffled through the system made Dr. Harrison's stomach twist. He'd seen too many kids fall through the cracks, their potential lost. The idea came to him suddenly, though looking back, perhaps it had been forming for some time. He could provide a home for Andra. He had the space, the resources, and though he'd never considered himself father material, something about this felt right. When he mentioned his thoughts to Patricia, her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "James, do you know what you're getting yourself into? This isn't like adopting a puppy. This is a child who's been through trauma. Not to mention," she hesitated, "not to mention he's black and I'm not." Dr. Harrison finished her thought. Patricia sighed. "You know this town. Some folks here still live like it's 1950. She wasn't wrong. Riverbrook wasn't known for its progressive attitudes. Dr. Harrison had overheard enough conversations in the hospital cafeteria to know exactly what some people would say. But the more he thought about it, the more certain he became. When he broached the subject with Andra, the boy's reaction wasn't what he expected. "Why would you want me?" Andra asked, suspicion in his eyes. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Dr. Harrison replied simply. "I know you're brave and smart. I know you deserve a chance. And I know that for whatever reason, I can't bear the thought of you leaving." The process wasn't easy. There were home studies, background checks, interviews and paperwork, mountains of paperwork. Throughout it all, whispers followed them around town. Some supported the doctor's decision, calling it admirable. Others were less kind, questioning his motives or ability to raise a child so different from himself. Dr. Harrison's colleagues were divided. The hospital administrator pulled him aside one day, voice low. "James, have you really thought this through? It's not just about good intentions. There are cultural considerations." "I'm aware," Dr. Harrison replied coolly. "And I'm learning. We both are." Finally, after months of uncertainty, the adoption was approved. The day Andra moved into Dr. Harrison's colonial-style home on Maple Street marked the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, A family formed not from blood, but from circumstance and choice. Neither could have known then how this unexpected beginning would one day lead them to save the very town that watched their story unfold with such mixed emotions. But that part of their journey was still years away, waiting just beyond the horizon of their new life together. The first morning Andrew woke up in his new bedroom, he forgot where he was. For a few peaceful seconds, he thought he might hear his mother calling him for breakfast or his father's deep laugh from the kitchen. Then reality crashed back, and the unfamiliar ceiling above reminded him everything had changed. Down the hall, Dr. Harrison was already awake, nervously making pancakes. He'd never considered himself much of a cook, but he wanted this first real day together to start off right. When Andrew finally came downstairs, his eyes still heavy with sleep, an awkward silence fell between them. "I made breakfast," Dr. Harrison said, gesturing to the slightly burned pancakes. "I'm afraid I'm better at surgery than cooking." Andrew managed a small smile. "My dad couldn't cook either." It was the first of many painful moments as they tried to build a life together. Neither knew exactly how to act around the other. Dr. Harrison worried constantly about saying the wrong thing, while Andrew kept waiting for the man to change his mind about the whole arrangement. School proved to be its own battlefield. The kids in Riverbrook had grown up together, and a new face was big news, especially one that looked different from most of them. Andrew's first week was a blur of stares, whispers, and pointed questions. "Is that doctor really your dad now?" one boy asked during lunch. "How's that work?" Another boy was less curious and more cruel. "My dad says Dr. Harrison just wants to look good, says it's for show." Andrew came home with a black eye the following week. He refused to tell Dr. Harrison what happened, but the doctor could guess. That night, after Andrew went to bed, Dr. Harrison sat in his study with his head in his hands, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Not about adopting Andrew, he had no doubts there, but about whether he could truly protect him in this town. "I don't know what I'm doing," he confessed to Patricia over coffee the next day. "How do I help him through this when I've never experienced anything like what he's going through?" Patricia gave him a look that was both kind and stern. "You listen, you learn. And you love that boy enough to stand up for him, even when it's uncomfortable." Taking her advice to heart, Dr. Harrison began educating himself. He read books about transracial adoption, joined online parent groups, and reached out to black colleagues for guidance. Most importantly, he started having honest conversations with Andrew. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing watching fireflies dance across the yard, Andrew finally opened up. "The other kids said you're not my real dad," he said quietly. "And I guess they're right." Dr. Harrison felt his chest tighten. "Biology isn't what makes a family, Andrew. Love is. Commitment is. I may not be your first father, but I promise you I'm just as real." Andrew nodded slowly. "But we don't look alike." "No," Dr. Harrison agreed. "And that means there are things about your life I won't understand firsthand. But I'm trying to learn. And I want you to always tell me when I get something wrong." As autumn turned to winter, small changes began to take shape. Andrew joined the school science club where he made his first friend, a quiet boy named Ty, who shared his interest in astronomy. Dr. Harrison cut back his hospital hours to be home when Andrew returned from school, and they established a routine of cooking dinner together, both improving their skills through many burnt attempts and kitchen accidents that often ended in laughter. The town's reaction remained mixed. Some, like Mr. Wilson at the hardware store, went out of their way to make Andrew feel welcome. Others crossed the street when they saw them coming or fell silent when they entered the diner for Sunday breakfast. Dr. Harrison found himself changing too. When a patient made an offhand comment about Andrew, suggesting the adoption was some kind of charity case, the normally reserved doctor firmly showed the man the door and preferred him to another physician. "You don't have to fight every battle for me," Andrew told him afterward, though he couldn't hide the small smile of appreciation. "Maybe not," Dr. Harrison replied. "But this home, our family, it's worth fighting for." By the time Christmas arrived, something had shifted between them. The house that had once felt strange to Andrew now held familiar comforts. His science projects sprawled across the dining table, his favorite cereal in the pantry, the way Dr. Harrison, whom he cautiously started calling Dad, would absent-mindedly hum old songs while reading medical journals. They were still learning, still making mistakes, still facing challenges from the outside world. But slowly, day by day, they were becoming what neither had expected to find again, a family. 3 years passed, and the Harrison home on Maple Street had transformed. Photos lined the walls now. Andrew receiving a science fair medal, father and son fishing at the lake, both of them covered in paint after a messy attempt to redecorate the kitchen. What had once felt awkward now felt like home. Andrew, now 15, had grown several inches taller. His voice had deepened, and he'd taken to wearing glasses that made him look studious, which suited him perfectly, as he'd become one of the top students in his class. The initial bullying had faded, though not disappeared entirely. But Andrew had found his place with the science club kids and a few teammates from the track team, where his natural speed had earned him respect. "Dad," Andrew called one Saturday morning, bursting into the kitchen where Dr. Harrison was attempting to follow a recipe for French toast. "The hospital called. They need a volunteer for the health fair next weekend, and I said I'd help." Dr. Harrison smiled, noticing how casually Andrew had used the word dad now. It had taken almost a year before he felt comfortable saying it, but these days it flowed naturally. "You don't have to spend your weekend at the hospital just because I do," Dr. Harrison said, flipping a piece of bread that was definitely more brown than golden. Andrew rolled his eyes. "I want to. Besides, I need the volunteer hours for my college applications." College. The word still caught Dr. Harrison by surprise sometimes. It seemed like yesterday that Andrew had arrived, a traumatized 12-year-old. Now he talked about medical schools and specialized programs, his future stretching out before him full of possibility. The health fair became just the first of many weekends Andrew spent at the hospital. He started as a volunteer, restocking supplies and directing visitors, but his natural curiosity soon had him shadowing nurses and asking the lab technicians endless questions. "That boy of yours has a gift," Dr. Wong, the chief of cardiology, told Dr. Harrison one day. "He connects with patients in a way that can't be taught." It was true. Andrew had an ability to make people feel at ease, whether they were nervous children getting their first shots or elderly patients confused about their medications. He listened in a way that many trained professionals didn't, with complete attention and genuine care. At home, they developed their own rituals and inside jokes. Sunday mornings meant pancakes, which they'd both finally learned to make without burning, and nature documentaries. Whenever one of them had a bad day, the other would leave a chocolate bar on their pillow, a simple gesture that said, "I see you're struggling, and I'm here." They'd even created their own holiday traditions. Neither had much family left, so they'd started inviting others who might be alone. Ty and his mother who had moved to town after a difficult divorce, Patricia and her wife who had become like family, and occasionally patients who had nowhere else to go. Not everything was perfect. They still had arguments about curfews, about Andrew's increasing independence, about Dr. Harrison's tendency to work too many hours, and the town of Riverbrook hadn't completely embraced them. There were still stores where they got poor service and neighbors who never returned their waves. But they'd found their rhythm together, a dance of mutual respect and growing love that made the difficulties manageable. One evening, Dr. Harrison came home exhausted after a 12-hour shift to find Andrew in the kitchen, carefully preparing spaghetti, his specialty. "You looked tired on your call earlier," Andrew explained with a shrug. "Thought you could use a night off from cooking." Dr. Harrison felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to his eyes. This thoughtful young man was a far cry from the angry, hurt child he'd first brought home. Later that night, as they sat on the porch enjoying the summer evening, Andrew grew quiet. "What's on your mind?" Dr. Harrison asked, recognizing the look of deep thought on his son's face. "I've been thinking about the free clinic," Andrew said slowly. "It's not enough, you know. Half the people in town can't afford proper health care, especially since the factory started cutting back shifts." Dr. Harrison nodded. The economic troubles in Riverbrook had been growing steadily worse. "What would you suggest?" he asked, genuinely curious. Andrew's eyes lit up with passion. "We could expand it. Offer more services, maybe even mobile clinics for the rural areas. I've been researching programs in other towns that—" Dr. Harrison listened, smiling slightly as Andrew outlined his vision with growing enthusiasm. It was in moments like these he could see the future taking shape, not just Andrew's future as a doctor, but something bigger than both of them. Neither could have guessed how soon that future would arrive, or how desperately Riverbrook would need them both. The day Andrew left for college was sunny but cool, a perfect September morning that felt too cheerful for such a goodbye. Dr. Harrison helped load the last box into the car, trying to hide how his hands shook slightly. "You have everything. Laptop charger, extra socks, your prescription," Dr. Harrison asked for the third time that morning. Andrew laughed. "Dad, I'm going to medical school, not the moon. I'll be back for Thanksgiving before you know it." They stood awkwardly in the driveway for a moment before Andrew stepped forward and wrapped his arms around his father. At 18, he stood eye to eye with Dr. Harrison now. "Thank you," Andrew whispered, "for everything." Dr. Harrison held him tight, remembering the frightened 12-year-old boy he'd once been. "I'm so proud of you," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. As Andrew's car disappeared down Maple Street, the house felt immediately emptier. Dr. Harrison stood in the doorway a long time, already counting the days until Thanksgiving. Change came to Riverbrook too, but not the good kind. The factory that had been the town's biggest employer for decades finally closed its doors completely. 200 people lost their jobs in a single day. Main Street shops began to close one by one, first the bookstore, then the family-owned hardware store, and finally even the diner where Dr. Harrison and Andrew had eaten Sunday breakfast for years. "It's like watching a slow-motion car crash," Patricia said one day at the hospital as they watched another family load their belongings into a moving truck, leaving town for good. The hospital felt the effects too. Budget cuts meant fewer nurses, longer hours, and outdated equipment. Dr. Harrison found himself working 6 and sometimes 7 days a week, trying to cover the gaps left by doctors who had moved to better-paying jobs in the city. The free clinic he'd started years ago became overwhelmed with patients who had lost their insurance along with their jobs. Dr. Harrison dipped into his own savings to keep it running, but it wasn't enough. Worse still was what he saw happening to his patients. People who couldn't afford their heart medication or insulin. Children with untreated infections because their parents couldn't take time off from their new precarious jobs. And more people coming in with problems related to pain pills, first prescriptions, then street drugs when those ran out. "We lost another one last night," the emergency room doctor told him one morning. 26 years old. Overdose. Third one this month. The young man had been someone Dr. Harrison knew, the son of a former factory worker, a kid who'd played baseball with Andrew in middle school. That night, Dr. Harrison sat alone in his kitchen, a cup of cold coffee in front of him, and wrote a long email to Andrew. He tried to keep his weekly updates positive, not wanting to burden his son during his first challenging year of medical school. But tonight, he needed to be honest about what was happening to their town. Miles away, Andrew read his father's email with growing concern. The tone was different from the usual updates about garden progress and hospital gossip. He could feel the weight of his father's worry through the screen. The next morning, Andrew called his favorite professor to ask about community health interventions in economically depressed areas. It was the beginning of a research project that would eventually change the direction of his studies. Back in Riverbrook, things continued to worsen. A town meeting about the crisis turned into a shouting match between those who blamed the factory owners, those who blamed the government, and those who had no one to blame but needed solutions. Dr. Harrison stood to speak, hoping to focus the conversation on immediate health needs, but was drowned out by angry voices from all sides. The town was fracturing along lines of class, race, and politics, all tensions finding new fuel in desperation. The dean of the medical school looked confused when Andrew walked into his office with a stack of papers. "You want to do what?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. "I want to change my focus," Andrew explained, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Instead of surgery, I want to specialize in emergency medicine and public health." 4 years had passed quickly. Andrew was in his final year of medical school, on track for the surgical residency he'd always wanted. His professors had marked him as a rising star, someone destined for a prestigious hospital in a big city. "May I ask why?" The dean said, leafing through Andrew's proposal. "You have a brilliant future ahead in surgery." Andrew thought about the weekly video calls with his father, how Dr. Harrison's face had grown thinner, the dark circles under his eyes deeper. He thought about the stories his father no longer told him, the ones Andrew had to pry out with careful questions or learn from Patricia during their occasional phone calls. "My hometown is dying," Andrew said simply, "and I think I can help." 2 months later, Andrew pulled his car into the driveway of the house on Maple Street. The paint was peeling in places, the garden his father had once tended so carefully now overgrown. Andrew sat for a moment, gathering himself for what he might find inside. Dr. Harrison opened the door before Andrew could knock, a smile lighting up his tired face. "You're early," he said, pulling Andrew into a hug that felt frailer than it should have. "Finished my exams ahead of schedule," Andrew replied, studying his father's face with a doctor's trained eye. The subtle signs were all there: fatigue, strain, possibly even pain he was hiding. Inside the house, little had changed except for the stack of medical bills on the kitchen table that Dr. Harrison quickly tried to shuffle away. "Dad," Andrew said gently, "Patricia told me about your heart. Why didn't you?" Dr. Harrison sank into a kitchen chair. "You had enough to worry about with school. It's nothing serious, just need to watch my blood pressure." But Andrew knew better. The prescriptions lined up by the sink told a clearer story than his father's reassurances. "I've made a decision," Andrew said, sitting across from his father. "I'm coming back to Riverbrook after graduation." Dr. Harrison's head snapped up. "Absolutely not. There's nothing for you here anymore. The hospital is barely functioning, half the town is gone." "Exactly why I need to come back," Andrew interrupted. "I've been researching what's happening here, Dad. Riverbrook isn't unique. Small towns all over are facing these same healthcare crises, but there are solutions, new approaches." "Andrew," Dr. Harrison said, his voice suddenly sounding very old, "I don't want you sacrificing your future for this place, not after everything you've worked for." Andrew reached across the table to take his father's hand. "You taught me that helping people isn't a sacrifice, it's a privilege." The next morning, Andrew drove through town, shocked by what he saw. Boarded-up storefronts, empty playgrounds, houses with foreclosure signs. He barely recognized Main Street. At the hospital, things were even worse. The once bustling halls felt deserted, with fewer staff rushing between rooms. Equipment looked outdated, supplies limited. Patricia nearly cried when she saw him. "Please tell me you're here to take your father home for a proper rest," she said, hugging him tightly. "He won't listen to any of us." "Working on it," Andrew promised. "But first, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with here." He spent the next days talking to everyone: nurses, remaining doctors, patients, pharmacists. Each conversation revealed another piece of a complex puzzle. The hospital was understaffed and underfunded. The opioid crisis had hit Riverbrook particularly hard. And something else kept coming up, a pattern of unusual symptoms in patients from the same neighborhoods. "It started about 8 months ago," one nurse explained. "Skin rashes, digestive issues, breathing problems, mostly in people from the east side of town." Andrew pulled out a map and started marking cases, a cluster emerging around the neighborhoods downhill from the old factory. That evening, he took water samples from different parts of town, using a test kit he brought from the university lab. When the results came back, his suspicions were confirmed. Something was very wrong with the water in those neighborhoods. "Dad," he said urgently, finding Dr. Harrison dozing in his study, "I think I know what's making people sick. It's not just economic stress or lack of health care. Something's contaminating the water supply where the factory used to dump waste." Dr. Harrison blinked awake, taking a moment to process Andrew's words. Then he straightened, a familiar determination crossing his face. "Show me what you found," he said. As they spread papers across the dining table, working together like they had so many times over homework years ago, Dr. Harrison felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. What neither of them realized was that their discovery would soon put them at the center of a storm that would either save Riverbrook or tear apart what little community remained. The town hall was packed tighter than it had been in years. People stood along the walls, spilled out into the hallway, all drawn by the urgent flyers Andrew and Dr. Harrison had distributed throughout Riverbrook. The room hummed with nervous energy as Andrew stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Many of you remember me as Dr. Harrison's son. Today, I'm also speaking to you as a doctor." He glanced at his father, who sat in the front row, looking both proud and worried. Dr. Harrison had argued against holding this meeting, concerned about the backlash they might face. But Andra had been firm. The people of Riverbrook deserved to know what was happening to them. "For the past 2 weeks, I've been testing water samples from across town," Andra continued, clicking to show images on the screen behind him. These tests show dangerous levels of industrial chemicals in the water supply of the East Side neighborhoods, the same neighborhoods where we're seeing unusual rates of illness. A murmur ran through the crowd. Andra held up his hands for quiet. "The contamination appears to be coming from improper disposal of chemicals at the old factory site. When it rains, these toxins seep into the groundwater." From the back of the room, a voice called out, "Are you saying our kids are being poisoned?" Andra took a deep breath. "Yes, and it's been happening for at least a year." The room erupted. Parents clutched their children closer, elderly residents whispered worriedly to each other, and a man in the second row stood up angrily. "That's my grandson in the hospital right now with breathing troubles," he shouted. "Been sick for months with no answers." Others joined in, voices overlapping in fear and anger. Andra glanced at his father, who nodded encouragingly. This was exactly what Dr. Harrison had worried about, panic spreading through an already fragile community. "Please," Andra raised his voice above the noise. "We've prepared information packets with what we know so far, including which water sources are safe to use. The most important thing now is to get clean water to affected areas and begin proper testing of all residents who may have been exposed." From the side of the room, a woman in an expensive suit stood up. Andra recognized her as the former factory owner's daughter, now head of the company that had relocated operations overseas. "These are serious accusations," she said coldly. "Do you have proof that connects these alleged health issues directly to the factory site? Because without it, this sounds like fear-mongering from a young doctor looking to make a name for himself." Before Andra could respond, Dr. Harrison rose from his seat, his face flushed with anger. "My son graduated at the top of his class," he said, his voice carrying across the room without a microphone. "He has nothing to prove. What he does have is evidence. Evidence I've reviewed myself and found conclusive. People are sick. Children are sick, and we know why." Another voice called out, "Why should we trust either of you? You're not even from here originally." The words hung in the air, their meaning clear to everyone. Despite nearly 20 years in Riverbrook, despite his service at the hospital, Dr. Harrison was still considered an outsider by some. And Andra even more so. Andra felt a familiar knot in his stomach, the same one he'd felt as a 12-year-old facing bullies in the school cafeteria. But then he noticed something. For every hostile face in the crowd, there were 3 or 4 worried, hopeful ones looking to him for answers. "You don't have to trust me," Andra said quietly into the microphone. "Trust the evidence. Trust what your own bodies are telling you." He clicked to the next slide, showing a map of reported illnesses overlaid with water contamination levels. The correlation was undeniable. "This isn't about me or my father," he continued. "This is about Riverbrook. About your children and grandchildren. About whether this town has a future at all." From the back of the room, Andrew's old friend from Science Club, who now worked at the local pharmacy, stood up. "I've been keeping records of prescription changes," he said. "Asthma medications, skin treatments, digestive medications, all up by over 200% in the affected neighborhoods." Andrew's right. Something's happening and we need to deal with it. Others began to speak up. A teacher describing how many children were missing school due to illness, a nurse confirming the unusual pattern of symptoms, an elderly resident recalling how the factory used to dump waste directly into the ground back in the day. Slowly, the mood in the room shifted from accusation to determination. When Andra proposed forming an emergency response team, hands went up across the room to volunteer. As the meeting ended, Dr. Harrison made his way to Andra's side, moving slower than he once had, but with unmistakable pride in his eyes. "You did good," he said simply, "but this is just the beginning." Andra nodded, watching as people clustered in groups, already organizing water distribution and health screenings. "I know. They'll fight us every step of the way." Dr. Harrison squeezed his son's shoulder. "Not they. We, for all its flaws, This is our town too. Outside the town hall, dark clouds gathered. The coming storm would bring rain. Rain that would once again wash toxins into the water supply. The clock was ticking, and neither Andrew nor his father realized just how powerful the forces aligned against them would prove to be. 6 months later, the front yard of the Harrison home looked nothing like it once had. Instead of flower beds, there were stacks of bottled water. The living room had transformed into a makeshift headquarters, walls covered with maps, test results, and volunteer schedules. The dining table where Andrew had once done his homework now held medical supplies and water testing kits. "We need more volunteers for the North Side distribution," Andrew said, phone pressed to his ear as he made notes. At 27, he looked older than his years, his face showing the strain of months of fighting. The battle for Riverbrook had not been easy. After the town hall meeting, the factory company had launched a counter-campaign, questioning Andrew's findings and suggesting the health issues were due to lifestyle choices rather than water contamination. When that failed to convince people, they'd switched tactics, offering small settlements to affected families in exchange for their silence. But Andrew and Dr. Harrison had pushed forward. They'd brought in independent experts from the state university. They'd documented every case, mapped every cluster of illness, and taken hundreds of water samples. Most importantly, they'd built a coalition of Riverbrook residents committed to fighting for their town. "Dad, have you taken your medication?" Andrew asked, noticing his father rubbing his chest as he sorted through paperwork. Dr. Harrison waved him off. "Yes, doctor," he said with a small smile. "Stop worrying about me." But Andrew couldn't help worrying. The stress of the past months had taken its toll on his father's already weakened heart. Twice, Andrew had rushed him to the hospital after episodes of chest pain. Each time, Dr. Harrison had insisted on returning to work as soon as possible. "The governor's office called back," Dr. Harrison said, holding up his phone. "They're sending the environmental assessment team tomorrow." Andrew let out a long breath. They'd been pushing for state intervention for months. "That's good news." "It's because of your interview," Dr. Harrison said proudly. "When you showed those before and after blood tests on national TV, they couldn't ignore us anymore." The interview had been a turning point. After months of local struggle, Andrew had finally managed to get the attention of a major news network. The story of a small town poisoned by its former economic lifeline and the father-son doctor team fighting to save it had captivated viewers. Donations had poured in, along with offers of help from medical professionals and environmental experts across the country. But more important than the outside help was what had happened within Riverbrook itself. People who had never spoken to each other before were now working side by side distributing water. The town council, once divided, had united behind the cleanup effort. Even some former factory workers had come forward with information about past chemical dumping practices. The next morning, Andrew stood at the edge of the factory property, watching as state officials in protective gear collected samples from the soil. Beside him, leaning a little on his cane, Dr. Harrison observed with satisfaction. "Remember when you were 15 and you talked about expanding the free clinic?" Dr. Harrison asked suddenly. Andrew nodded. "You said I was thinking too big. And now look at you, leading a whole environmental health movement." A car pulled up nearby and Ty got out, carrying a stack of file folders. Over the months, he had become Andrew's right-hand man, using his pharmacy connections to help document medication changes throughout town. "The latest health survey results," Ty said, handing the folders to Andrew. "People in the east neighborhoods who switched to bottled water 3 months ago are already showing improvement. The rashes are clearing up, and asthma attacks are down by almost 30%. Andrew flipped through the pages, hope rising in his chest. "It's working," he said quietly. Dr. Harrison squeezed his son's shoulder. "Of course it is. Clean water, clear information, community support, that's real medicine." 2 weeks later, Andrew stood at a podium in the same town hall where their fight had begun. This time, the room wasn't filled with fear and anger, but with determination and cautious optimism. "The state has officially declared the factory site a hazardous waste area," Andrew announced. "Cleanup will begin next month, and they've approved emergency funding to replace water lines in the affected neighborhoods." The room erupted in applause. In the front row, Dr. Harrison beamed with pride, Patricia beside him wiping away tears. But our work isn't done, Andrew continued once the noise died down. Riverbrook needs more than clean water. We need jobs, opportunities, and healthcare that works for everyone. He unfolded a large blueprint and spread it on the table beside him. This is our proposal for a new community health center. Not just a clinic, but a place for preventive care, job training in medical fields, and environmental health monitoring. As he outlined the vision, faces in the audience lit up with something that had been missing in Riverbrook for years: hope. Later that evening, father and son sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset as they had so many times before. "Did you ever imagine this when you decided to adopt me?" Andrew asked. Dr. Harrison chuckled. "That you'd grow up to save the town. Can't say that was on my mind at the time." "That we'd save it together," Andrew corrected. Dr. Harrison looked out at their neighborhood, where porch lights were coming on and children played in yards that had been quiet for too long. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when I first brought you home, people said we didn't belong together, that we were too different." Andrew nodded, remembering those early painful days. "But maybe that was exactly what Riverbrook needed," Dr. Harrison continued. "Someone who could see things from the inside and the outside at the same time. Someone who knew what it meant to rebuild from loss." As stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat in comfortable silence, two men from different beginnings who had found their way to the same place, home. A home they had not only made for themselves, but had fought to preserve for everyone who lived there. The town that had once whispered about the unusual family now pointed to them with pride. The doctor who had adopted a black child and the son who had returned to his roots had shown what was possible when healing began with compassion and ended with action. Riverbrook's story was far from over, but its next chapter would be written with cleaner water, healthier children, and a community that had learned the hardest lesson of all, that we are, in the end, responsible for each other.